Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and these are my thoughts on A Canticle for Leibowitz. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, time for some thoughts today on my first pick for 2025's big pile of science fiction reading for my reading project, Science Fiction for the Somewhat Less Hesitant, following on from last year's Science Fiction for the Somewhat Hesitant. So yes, I'm a little bit better with science fiction now, and so I've moved on to some bigger stuff, some possibly more challenging stuff this year. So the first one today then is A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller Jr. from 1959. Before I get into the synopsis and my thoughts and all of that kind of stuff, I will give you the usual spoiler warning. I'm not going to spoil anything major, but I will be discussing obviously elements of the plot, etc., characters, things like that. So if you want to go into this completely blind without knowing anything other than what you can read on the blurb, on the back cover, etc., then do feel free to click away from this video now and come back when you've come back to watch it later when you've read it. So with that out of the way, a synopsis for you to start with then. So this is set in a post-apocalyptic world that has been ravaged by nuclear war. And first off, we meet a young novitiate, a novice monk called Francis, who is out in the desert fasting for Lent. And whilst he's out in the desert, he discovers an old fallout shelter with ancient documents hidden in it. And these fragmented blueprints, documents, etc., and scientific sort of schematics are relics of the pre-war civilization that embraced knowledge and progress, but that knowledge and progress then, directly led to the destruction of the world in a nuclear holocaust, which in this world is called the Flame Deluge. And this rediscovered memorabilia becomes kind of the foundation and sacred duty of an order of monks, the Order of Leibowitz, or what becomes the Order of Saint Leibowitz, which is dedicated to preserving the vestiges of humanity's scientific understanding, humanity's knowledge. And the novel is divided into three parts, each part being separated by centuries, making the time span that the novel covers being, I think, about 1800 years in total. So that's the basic setup of it, basically. So my thoughts on it then. This was okay for me. There was a lot I liked about it, but in the end, it was just a bit too much of a slog, unfortunately, for me to really enjoy it. I took a long time to get through this one. And as I say, although there were elements that I enjoyed, it wasn't ever really something that I looked forward to picking up and making some progress in. It always felt like hard work. So I'll look at the three parts kind of slightly separately because each part is quite different. And that goes some way to tell you what I did and didn't like about it. So the first part, which is called Fiat Homo, so Let There Be Man, follows this brother Francis in 600 years, I think it is, after the Flame Deluge. And he is seeking or part of a movement to seek canonization for Leibowitz. Leibowitz was an engineer from the time, from the time before, essentially, the civilized world that was destroyed in the Flame Deluge. And Brother Francis and his order, they all grapple with the implications of this rediscovered knowledge. Because the Church, the Catholic Church, is now more powerful than any other nation state that exists in this world. And it carefully controls and interprets this memorabilia, this fragmented information that's found. And it attempts to kind of protect humanity from repeating past mistakes. I enjoyed this first sort of story, if you like, this first part, quite a bit. This actually did get me hooked in. The intrigue of it, finding out, finding this monk finding this fallout shelter, him finding this and the memorabilia and connecting it to Leibowitz and the excitement that he has, and then sort of the way that the order handle it. The life of Brother Francis, generally, that's what this part is. It follows him over a number of years. I really liked him as a character, actually. He's not the sharpest tool in the box. He gets himself into trouble quite a bit. And the relationships between him and the abbot of the order and the other monks in the order and how they live, what they do, etc. There was quite a lot of warmth there. There's plenty of atmosphere, and there's quite a lot of humour as well. The humour in it is quite sharp. Plus, there's plenty to think about on it. The language, immediately, as soon as I jumped in, though, I knew was going to prove quite challenging. There's a lot of Latin bits in it. There's a lot about monastic life. There's quite a lot of stuff about dogma and theology in there, which isn't my strong point, I have to say. And I did find it quite hard going, despite it being interesting and entertaining at the same time. But I was more than happy to kind of put in the work to kind of get through that, because it was entertaining. I ended up really invested in Brother Francis's story, and I was kind of sorry to see that part end, to be honest. Then the second part, which is Fiat Lux, which is Let There Be Light. This is where my attention started to wane quite quickly. It shifts quite dramatically. It takes place 600 years after the first part, and this is as a new renaissance dawns in the world. So Leibowitz is now Saint Leibowitz. Leibowitz was canonized, and the Order of Saint Leibowitz, their archives becomes kind of a wealth of all of this information that they've collected over the years and stored, conserved. And they've got, secular scholars coming in to look at it, to learn from it. And it starts to kind of, aid scientific advancement and, the idea that civilization can be rebuilt. But it also deals with the fact that, the allure of this knowledge, this technology that can come from this knowledge could once again threaten to sort of outpace humanity's moral development from where they are at this point. And it's still quite sort of barbaric in a lot of ways at that point. The characters in this part, for me, this is where it kind of lost me. The characters weren't anywhere near as engaging as they were in the first. And there's just a hell of a lot of very long and dense conversations. It's a series of conversations more than anything else. Not a lot happens plot-wise. I mean, the plot throughout the entire book is minimal, should we say. But this was one where it really was just kind of, it felt like a series of very long, very dense conversations using quite difficult language. It was very much a discussion on sort of the dangers of rediscovering this old knowledge and who should be permitted to use it, and how the use of that knowledge in reinventing essentially past technology could lead to the repeating of past mistakes. And that should be interesting. The cyclical nature of history I do find interesting, but the way it was written and the lack of kind of, I think for me, engaging characters, atmosphere, things like that were in the first part, I found a lot of it quite impenetrable and unfortunately somewhat dull. And that, to me, it shouldn't have been that dull, because it's an interesting topic, but it was just, it was the way that it was done. The way that it was done just wasn't for me in terms of engagement. And then part 3 is called Fiat Voluntas Tua, so Thy Will Be Done, and this is set another 600 years later, and this is as humanity's kind of rebuilt to a point exceeding the technology, the developments of the pre-Flame Deluge era. But old habits die hard. And the world again descends into a brutal kind of nuclear arms race, essentially. The Order of St. Leibowitz now kind of faces the ultimate test in terms of it's struggling to kind of preserve life and knowledge again as another devastating war looms on the horizon. This was the most science fiction-y part by far. I would say in general, the book didn't really feel like science fiction to me for the most part. It felt more like literary fiction with science fiction elements, or post-apocalyptic. It's a post-apocalyptic book, but it felt very literary in a lot of ways. There wasn't a huge amount of science fiction, what I'd call science fiction, until you get to the end of it, to the final part. But the science fiction stuff in part 3 was a really welcome change, a welcome addition. Here we're back to a civilized world, with technology and the inevitable reinvention of nuclear tech and weaponry, and all the threats that come with that, as well as spaceships and self-driving cars and human colonies that are already populating other planets, things like that. This was the part, I think, that was the most accessible for me, certainly in terms of its prose, and it also moved along at a much more comfortable pace for me. I enjoyed quite a lot of that element to it in terms of I didn't find it difficult. I didn't find it too challenging in terms of its language. I didn't find it dull at any point, anything like that. It felt more immediate, and there was more kind of tension there for sure, and I really enjoyed that shift in pace, especially after the second part. So the 3 parts, it's a mixed bag. It's 3 different stories, so I think you kind of have to almost treat it as like a story collection in some respects, in that there's not everything in that collection is necessarily going to be your cup of tea. I enjoyed the first part and I enjoyed the third part for different reasons, but the second part, not so much. I mean, overall, it's a book of ideas, really, more than anything else. I think, as I've said, the plot is quite minimal. The characters, there are some good characters. There are some characters which are just a kind of a vehicle, a voice for a point of discussion, for an idea. The atmosphere varies. It's not the strongest point in it, for sure, but it's not bad. The writing, the prose is, it's accomplished. It's dense, it's rich, it's challenging. It's a little too much for me, I think, on the whole, but it's good, it's well written in that respect. But yeah, it's just maybe not my cup of tea in terms of the amount of dense stuff in there. But at its heart, this is a book of ideas, for sure. About the cyclical nature of history. As I've said, are we destined to always repeat past mistakes, however horrific and catastrophic those mistakes might be? There are ideas, many, many ideas, as you'd expect, about faith, and how spiritual faith and the hope that comes from that faith helps people get through the toughest of situations. There are plenty of ideas about knowledge, through a discussion on the need to conserve knowledge, to protect knowledge, save knowledge, but also about the sort of control of knowledge to avoid it being used in the wrong ways with dire results. There's, good discussion on that. And again, as you'd expect, there's a lot that calls back to the history of the Catholic Church in Europe, especially during the Middle Ages. And I do know some of that history reasonably well. I have studied it a little bit in the past. And so that was definitely of interest, for sure. So there was, there's plenty of ideas in there. There's tons and tons of ideas in there. Those are just a few of the main ones. I did feel sometimes with some of the discussions and the arguments that there was sometimes a little bias, maybe. And yeah, I would have liked to have seen more, kind of a bit more of a a nuanced discussion on some stuff in it. Okay, to sum up then, so I think the strength for this particularly is its ideas. As much as I have my niggles with sometimes with how those ideas are debated, presented, discussed, it's a book full of ideas, and I can appreciate all of those, and it's got some interesting things to say and plenty to think about. Major weakness with it, I think, is its plot. There's not much there, but it's not about that. Do you know what I mean? It's not about that. My enjoyment of it, which is my primary focus going forwards in terms of, you know, how I think about and kind of talk about books, it was okay, is what I'd say. I didn't dislike it, but I can't necessarily say that I really enjoyed it. As I say, it was a bit of a slog to get through in the most part. It was, it just about paid off with its ideas and giving me plenty to think about. But yeah, it was hard work. I'm going to give it a 3-star rating on Storygraph because of that. There's, as I say, there is stuff to like in it, and your mileage may vary on it depending on how you get on with the kind of the sort of prose that it is. But for me, it's a solid 3-star read. So will I read any more Miller then? Possibly, but the jury's out, I think, on that one. I'm not in any hurry, but I wouldn't, never say never. I think it is just probably a case that this just wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. So there we go. That is the first of my 2025 reads for my big old science fiction project this year. Next up for this project will be Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, something very, very different, some space horror. I will have my thoughts out for that next week. But for today, that will do from me, I think. So thank you very much for watching, folks. As always, do drop your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read A Canticle for Leibowitz, and what did you think of it? I will be back on Sunday with some more bookish ramblings. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.